Okay, so hopefully you're in the right workshop. This is the From Chinatown to China workshop. Yes? Okay, awesome. Looks like we have a bunch of friends here and some faces that we don't know very well, but welcome. I'm Helena, Helena Wong with CAB Organizing Asian Communities, and I was part of the delegation that went to China this past year. And we're going to do some quick, just who we are on the panel, and then take it from there, yeah?
Hi everyone, my name is Alex with the Chinese Progressive Association based in San Francisco.
And my name is Ellen David Friedman. I have in China, I'm a visiting scholar at the International Labor Center at Sun Yat-sen University. And in the US, I'm primarily involved in labor notes.
Hi everybody, I'm Esther Wong, formerly of CAB Organizing Asian Communities, and also was part of the delegation to China this past year, or last December, and have been there for the past 6 months.
So we're not going to be doing a workshop on kind of what we did over the 2 weeks that we were in China. More, we wanted this to be a session where we shared some of the learnings and particularly around what is happening on the ground in China. We were able to kind of visit different kinds of organizations and also spend a significant amount of time with individuals who are doing work particularly around labor in China. And so Ellen has spent a number of years in China studying the labor movement and working with students in a university setting. Esther spent the last 6 months kind of visiting with people around the country. And so part of what we wanted to do was also to get a sense of what it is that you wanted out of it, so that our speakers here, they're very quick on their feet and can kind of adjust whatever they're going to say to hopefully to answer some of the questions that you have as well. So just kind of wanted to get a sense if there are any specific questions that that we can try to address during this time that you might have. Anybody? Oh, okay, I guess. Yeah.
Yes.
Myself, okay. Oh, I'm just interested to hear your views on how you will link your experiences in China and how to build international solidarity between the movement here, whether in Chinatown or the larger labor movement, and the labor movement in China.
Great, definitely something we're going to be touching on. Awesome. Any other questions that you would like us to kind of touch on?
I think building off of that is like, what are you bringing back, both to your collective organizations, but also the communities that you're working with?
I'm interested in how the labor movement, independent labor movement in China is organized. Like, to what extent is it underground groups? To what extent is it above ground groups, formal, informal? What are those big groups? How do people communicate across regions strategically?
Yeah, I mean, it's been, but I was wondering more about, like, you know, the ways in which the labor movement organizes in China and how we can apply it to undocumented workers here, and just how can you translate that over?
Yes, I was wondering, you know, sort of what sort of political consciousness do these Chinese workers who are engaging in labor struggles have? I mean, I know there are some wildcat strikes and stuff going on, but how do they see themselves politically? I mean, sort of beyond the immediate processes of production.
Okay, awesome. All right, so there's also going to be another opportunity for more Q&A after the presentations. And then really quickly, just a quick survey of the room. How many of you have done some significant study on China or know China pretty well? Okay, cool. And how many of you have been to China? Okay, cool. Okay, it's okay. We'll cover Hong Kong too.
We're already starting with it very politically.
And then how many of you, how many people feel like you don't know much about China at all and need some kind of context? Okay, so mixed, yeah? All right, cool. Then we are going to get this show started. Our panelists have different degrees of experience with China as well and being in China. So if you guys can kind of talk a little bit about who you are and yeah, what your experience with being in China or learning about China has been. Yeah. And that would just be like the very quick.
So I'll start. So my name is Alex again. I'm with the Chinese Progressive Association, and CPA was formed about 4 years ago, and it was known for its position in the community to support the Chinese liberation in the community, and also marginalized because of that. And so there was a very official relationship with the Chinese government at that time, and there were many delegations that went to China. And there was a break from that during Tiananmen Square, and there was a distancing. And so from 89 to, I would say, the 90s, there was more of a push within the organization to really develop more grassroots understanding of what's happening in China. So one of the opportunities that came up for us was the WTO in 2005, where it was in Hong Kong, right? And so for a lot of people in the movement that came out of the 90s, we saw Seattle as the fight in Seattle, right? And so for us, we used 2005 WTO as a place to do that. Am I going too much, or? Is this...
Well, wrap it up, but yeah,
Okay.
just.
So there you go. That was our introduction to really trying to build on a grassroots level, which is why we did this, why we really tried to push forward with this trip.
My experience for about 30 or 35 years in the United States is as a labor organizer, working within the institutional labor environment of the United States at the end of the golden era of formal institutional labor relations. And my interest in China started out, I would say, as it must, if you're not familiar with the country, in a rather naive level about presuming that what we were seeing there was the birth of a new industrial proletariat under introduction of rapidly accelerating industrial capital formation, and that what we were going to see, therefore, was going to be a labor movement that I could recognize with my prism. And after 10 years living there, almost half of each year for most of the last 10 years, I mean, rather deeply involved at different stages of the labor movement, and especially with scholars, students, grassroots activists, and trade unionists, I have concluded that there is not that much that is useful that we take from the perspective of the history of the development of industrial capitalism in the West to try and understand China and its labor movement. And having said that, I would say that it is the most important labor movement to understand, and the labor capital conflict that is erupting there explosively year after year after year, but not taking institutional form, we really need to understand. And if I could just take a moment to also particularly welcome and acknowledge the contributions of my colleague here, John Liu, who is from the mainland, who is now a professor at Temple University and she's one of a great new emerging generation of Chinese scholars who are really attempting to develop a critical analysis of the labor situation. So I hope you'll join us with your comments.
Sorry, I'm still really jet lagged. So the question was our relationship basically to this panel, correct? Okay. So I was on staff at CAV for many, many years, and a big part of our membership base is Chinese immigrants, mostly from the mainland, and my parents as well, family background comes from that as well. So I think from that experience, and then being in the US and kind of seeing how China, the idea of China and fear of China is used on so many different levels as a political wedge, without actually a really deep understanding of what is actually happening in the country, particularly I think in respect to grassroots organizing. I really wanted to go and begin to have a deeper understanding of that for myself, mostly because I think we all come from this perspective where it's actually really important, particularly now to really kind of, because even, I think even on the left, there's not that understanding of China. We always talk about, oh, we want to build international solidarity, but no one really knows how to do that with movements in Asia, particularly in China, I think for a variety of reasons. And so I think part of what we want to do is to start to do that and to build that.
So the first two questions that each of the panelists will address is, what are you seeing in China, right? What's happening socially, politically, economically? Where are the main fights, and how are people organizing? And whoever wants to start us off can. Inclinations.
Let's go in order from Alex down here. I'm me.
So,
Sorry.
So when we went on the trip, and many of us have also just been back and forth in China. Like I studied in southern China for about a year, and it wasn't a political trip. But going on this trip and this delegation, that we were very fortunate to have Ellen to be our host. We were able to see a lot of different and unique kinds of organizing, and labor movement, and I would say independent activists, and also the official kind of union movement, and then also anti-displacement movement. And in Beijing, we were able to visit a lot of groups around women's rights, and also queer and LGBTQ issues and the struggles there. So it was a wide array of, and we're not going to be able to get into all of those things, but I would just say some of the things that came up for me was that because of the kind of political economic conditions that have happened in China, so a very key thing is that there's high unemployment, especially with young people and people who are graduating from college, right? And that creates a certain kinds of conditions in the country where I think that, so in terms of people's kind of even material options to do things, to kind of have people actually go back into the factories to work, and that is actually a political project, right? So and that is connected, I think, to some of the work that Ellen has been doing, and a lot of the things that have happened within the university. And so that's one thing that I think is very helpful and is very inspiring for us. Some of the key goals that we wanted to list for us to move forward with this trip is that we wanted to build our understanding of what's happening on the ground, not trying to put out any solutions to figure out things. Even the question around how do we build solidarity is still a question, I think, for us. It's not, we don't necessarily have those answers, but we wanted to build those relationships. And the second thing too is because for so many of us that went to the WTO trip in 2005, actually Puck was there too, so some of us were there. It was very actually inspirational for us, and we've clarified that for us this trip is not like a motherland. It's not, what do we call it? It's not a motherland trip. We're not going back to embrace the motherland, but we are there to embrace the new and inspiring movement that has happened in the country. Because so much of what we know about China and what we've learned from our parents is it's very unclear, right? Because it could have been from very different generations, and also even China 5 years ago is very different from China right now. And the movement keeps changing and it's very vibrant. And so those are the two main things. The last thing was really trying to find a way for us to develop an analysis to share within left circles and progressives, because there is there's a lack of analysis and understanding China and also the Asia-Pacific region, the role that's going to be playing in the 21st century. And actually we see it as a strategic intervention for Chinese American activists who are organizing locally in the US, and also organizing new immigrants that are coming from China who can actually share those experiences, and also connecting with people in Asia at the same time. And I think that's something that we want to be able to provide more leadership on, because there are a lot of labor unions that are going back and forth to China. There are a lot of groups, a lot of people are talking about China too. So the exchanges in general have actually increased tremendously. But the kind of exchange and the unique contribution we're trying to provide is really understanding the conditions on the ground and to make those connections within the grassroots.
So I'll give a little two-part answer to this. What you see in China is both the creation of wealth at a totally unprecedented scale and speed in entirely stratified forms that we recognize from this country and elsewhere around the globe under conditions of neoliberal global capital, and all of the discontents that go along with that. So tremendous both pride and nationalism, which I think needs to be acknowledged and for good reason, right? It is a country which has drawn itself up and out of feudalism, some incredible gains during the socialist period between 1949 and 1978, but also tremendous disruption and dislocation under the Cultural Revolution. And then this last 30 years of development of capitalism. So, the accomplishments of literacy and healthcare and education and housing and so on are phenomenal and create a kind of nationalism. At the same time, so much anger, so much discontent, roiling distrust of leaders at every level. In the workplace, in the villages, in the township, tremendous concern about corruption of the government at all levels, concern about the wealth gap and the greed economy. This is very apparent. And so what you see on the ground is resistance, resistance, resistance. So there are tens of thousands of, we don't really know the number, but at least tens of thousands of what can be called mass incidents. Many of them are labor-based or either strikes. Sometimes they're very short. They might last a half a day. They might last a day or a week. There's also resistance within the workplace, always just daily resistance, that goes on normally, but also, sabotage. There are riots. There is instability around land taking, and a lot of social resistance around land taking that often includes a lot of violence. Sometimes villagers, taking their local cadre, their local, party officials and town government officers hostage, and barricading off the village and keeping the police out and keeping the army out because they're trying to defend their land against being taken and resold. So this is extraordinary, right? It's an extraordinary feeling of instability and insurrection within an authoritarian and very effective authoritarian state. So I'd just like to step back for one moment and give you the framework that I use to make sense of China, and it may be useful for you, which is this, that what we call globalization under neoliberal conditions has got to be understood as just the latest, in my mind, understood as the latest stage of capitalism's development, facing the conditions that are different now than they were, 30 years ago or 60 years ago. And that one of the things that is allowed at this current stage of technological development are a few things. One, what we think of as the retreat of the state from protection of society. So the withdrawal of state from its service to its own people, which means that in our country, in the EU, and in China as well, this last 30 years has been characterized by a destruction of social goods. And that means public education and a healthcare system and public housing and parks and libraries and so on. The things that sustain civic life and an open, lively civic space have declined everywhere. So even though China started from a very different place than the US did 30 years ago, they've been in decline. These things have been in decline in both countries for 30 years. The second, the increasing precarization of work and workers, which is just unmistakable, right? So temporary employment in China, agency labor, dispatch labor, gray market and black market labor, illegal, everything from human trafficking and so on to gang workers, being impressed from the villages to come into the cities to work in factories or construction. So a kind of a primitive or barbaric, what Marxists call primitive accumulation, is going on there and here. I mean, I bet many of you and many people that you know everywhere from the bottom to the top of society are working for jobs we would not consider necessarily formal. You're not sure that your contract is guaranteed, the jobs are not secure, your wages, your social insurance are uncertain, your idea about your pension and your future are not clear. Third, the statelessness of workers. So when we talk about immigration in this country, in the EU, many places in the world, we think of migrants who show up and are not allowed to gain access to statehood and citizenship rights. Now in China, the domestic workforce is, as I'm sure you are aware, 200 to 300 million domestic Chinese migrants coming from inland provinces out to the coast. They're actually beginning to return home now because capital is driving into the inland provinces. So these young workers are able to stay closer to home. But as long as you are not within your area of household registration, there's a household registration system in China, and as long as you are living outside of that, your access to legal rights and benefits and social insurance and the right to send your child to school elsewhere are proscribed, are limited. So when we think of the lack of access to laws, including, from my point of view, labor laws and labor protection is true for many millions of workers both in China and here. And the last point of convergence I will mention, although there are more, is the complete uselessness of the formal institutions of labor. So in this country, 7% if you average public and private sector are represented by unions. Even those unions are mostly just doing concessionary bargaining for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. That is to say, most workers, even with their unions, when they go to the table to bargain, are not making gains. At best, they're protecting what they have, but mostly they're losing. The unions are weak. Their density is smaller every year. They're unable to figure out how to deal with this new labor market, which is so precarious and is so stateless. The labor law is very far away from workers in this country, and this is also true in China. Despite their efforts in China to pass and improve labor laws, and despite the fact that the Chinese Union is the largest labor organization in the world with 300 million members, it is very, very far away from workers, the lives of workers, and the protection of workers. So I use a convergence kind of framework to think about China very often.
Actually, are you going to hit the how are people organizing?
I can.
Okay, great.
Sure. So I was only in China for 6 months, and like I was saying, though, I was spending a lot of that time traveling and meeting with different grassroots NGOs in China. I guess maybe, so some things that kind of, some like basic things I think about what's happening in China very broadly speaking that helped me, I think, give me a framework when I went, was one, the understanding of migrant labor within China, the internal process, labor migration in China, like Ellen was mentioning. There's something like 200 to 300 million people in China who are internal migrants, meaning they've left their home where they actually are registered. And that's really important because where you're registered gives you a level of access to social services that you don't have if you leave, that also spreads to your children, right? So that was important for me to understand, and I think the understanding that I had of how that process started was after the reforms of 1978, particularly the land reforms that happened that year, and then the decision by the central government to really push a certain kind of economic development, which has made China, I think, the sort of very state-controlled capitalist economy and political system that it is today. So that was important for me to understand. But I have to say, knowing that in my head before I went, and then actually being there even for 6 months, was totally, totally different. Kind of seeing, one, the scale that changes happen. So, when we talk about China in the last 30 years, a lot of it is this like incredibly rapid process of urbanization that has happened because of the economic policies that were put in place in the late 70s and accelerated in the 80s. So you have these huge cities that are driven almost exclusively by migrant labor, right? So I think Guangzhou, for example, is a city with what, like 20 million residents? And like a good 80% of those residents are not actually from Guangzhou. In Beijing, where I was staying, was the same. And it was also important for me to understand that much of the country is still very rural, right? And the countryside, rural and urban divide is massive, and that's one of the internal contradictions that's becoming sharper and sharper, I think, in the country. And honestly, I don't feel like I'm very qualified to be on this panel, but some of the things that I really saw and experienced were just, and through talking to people, was just a sense of like how all of these contradictions were increasing at such a rapid pace, right? Whether it was housing because of the real estate bubble in the major urban cities, environmental degradation that's happening due to capitalist development, whether it's factories or whether it's this push to drive the economy, and so we need more and more energy resources, or we need more coal plants. Corruption issues, right, with the official, the party, right? And I think in response to that, what people are doing, which you don't actually really see a lot, you don't hear a lot of in the States, what people are actually responding in really the only way that they can, which is actually by organizing protests, right? And so I put together some photos. Obviously, I didn't take all of them because some of them at the bottom say like Getty Images and AFP, but I gathered some of them just to kind of show a little bit of the range of what is actually happening on the ground. And I'm sure none of you think, right, that people in China are just these like passive objects, right, that are under the thumb of some like totalitarian government. But people really are responding in the ways by going out on the streets, right? And so some of these photos are of labor protests, right? Like you'll see people in their the uniforms that they have to wear as factory workers. This one is a recent protest against a chemical plant that was going to be built in a city in China called Kunming. This is from some of these photos from a massive strike of dock workers in Hong Kong who are fighting for better labor conditions at one of the ports that's owned by one of the richest men in the world, Li. So I think the sense that I got was more and more people are really, I think, feeling these contradictions, and they're more and more, I think, emboldened to act and respond. Under what I would say, from my experience in the US, are like actually very extreme constraints on their ability to actually act, right? Like there's very real repercussions to doing these sorts of actions. For example, some of the Kunming protesters, right, who are protesting this chemical plant called PX, the way that that was organized in particular was all online, right? And there was no one person who really led kind of the organizing push, at least publicly. But even then, some of the so-called organizers, i.e. like people who online spread the word, were actually taken in by like some apparatus of the state security system and questioned, right? And that happens all the time. So even doing things like this, like people take on a lot of risk to actually even publicly be out. And what people told me is happening more and more is that people are very openly and publicly coming out now, right? Like they won't wear masks, they won't hide who they are, they will show their face to photographers and say, take a photo of me, this is who I am. But I think the challenge with a lot of that though is if there aren't that many kind of organized institutional forms outside of the state in China, right? Like there's not this level of, I think, civil society that you have, for example, here, right, where anybody can really form a grassroots NGO and you can start doing the work that you want to do. There's various things that make it very complicated to do that in China, to register with the state. And if you're like, I want to be an NGO that's going to do grassroots labor organizing, they're going to be like, no, basically. I don't even know where I'm going with this anymore. But I think the summary that what I'm trying to say is that people are responding to these changes and are organizing, and a lot of it is happening online, but that's kind of just the vehicle for people to actually be out on the streets and pushing for real change. And that was really amazing to see.
And if I could take a moment to ask, to address the question that you raised, which is about this topic, which is, what about the independent labor organizing going on? I think, and others in the room may also study this, other specialists in this area, I think generally agree. China now is not like Poland in the 1980s. There is not a secret underground Solidarność in formation. The state is very, very effectively organized in China for several functions which it does not give up. And one of them is a sensing, surveillance, and corporatist function, which means it knows what people are doing. It absolutely knows what people are doing. And so if you are a factory worker and you've helped to organize even very quietly and very surreptitiously a strike, and even if during that strike you haven't been exposed, at some point someone is going to say, oh, this is the guy who sent out the emails, and you might get bounced from your job, and then you go to another factory and now you've got some consciousness and you might start organizing. There are definitely people that are doing that. There are people that are gaining incredible skills, knowledge, and sophistication that I've been able to see directly face-to-face over these last 10 years for knowing how to organize. It's inevitable. We can't not. Human beings can't not learn that lesson. But how to figure out how to do that within the Chinese state is rather complex. So you do it without the right to form an independent union. That if you link up with other workers, either within your factory or outside of your factory, that looks in any way like it has the potential to be sustainable, you will absolutely be restrained from doing that. And people certainly lose their jobs, get brought up on charges, get sent back home, different things happen that disrupt that. But even more importantly, it's a state that's producing lots of wealth and is very capable of incorporating dissent. So these labor NGOs would be a very long tangent if we took it, but I'm not very hopeful that these labor NGOs represent anything that we on the labor left would consider to be that significant. They are kept very, very small, but mostly their work is now carries out the needs of the state. Most of these labor NGOs are advising injured workers how to go apply for compensation for their injury. Things like that. They are not insurrectionary. So neither the NGOs nor the union have the ability to capture what is really happening, these contradictions Esther mentioned, and an independent union formation is not possible.
Yeah, I can add to that a little bit, unless Alex, you have something. So I think what was really interesting for me was, I was able to get a little bit of a deeper understanding of how different grassroots labor NGOs were actually operating, and how they thought of their work through some interviews and meetings and just kind of hanging out with them and spending time with them. I think one thing that's true that I'm sure a lot of you know is that in southern China, right, there's a lot more activity among labor activity, primarily because that was where a lot of the economic reforms were centered in terms of really wanting to bring in foreign investment and yada yada yada. And so there are a lot more labor NGOs in the south, particularly in Guangzhou and Shenzhen. And there's like a somewhat more of an open political climate in terms of what people can and can't do. And so I met with several different grassroots activists in Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, and just to hear about how they did their work. And I think it is true, like a lot of the work that they do is exactly what you said about just almost like service provision, right, for workers, right? Like you're injured, how do you file a workers' comp claim, right? What are your rights? Here are your legal rights, right? And it's not necessarily about challenging even why don't we have more rights, right? It's kind of like how can we access what we do have in this like limited space. But I do think that a lot of organizers are trying to move beyond that. I think a lot of times it's difficult to conceive of how to do that. And they would tell me like, and I would ask them questions like, what are you trying to do with all this work, right? Like I met two young people. They weren't actually that young. They were like my age. They were like, old-ish people.
Hardly.
I don't know. Late 20s, early 30s, who their work, it's all relative. Their work was basically they had decided to become factory workers themselves and use that opportunity as a way to engage other workers and to do their work, right? And I asked them like, what do you hope to accomplish with this, right? Like, what are you trying to do? And their answer was basically, we don't really know, right? But we feel it's important work, right? And then I would push them further, and where we kind of landed was they felt that it was important to do this work because the sense that they had as factory workers was that there's not a sense of workers themselves being part of a working class, right? And this is something that I've heard from a lot of people that I talked to, was that a lot of their work was even just trying to do that consciousness raising for workers themselves, to see themselves as part of the working class in China, right? And they did that through a variety of ways. They did that through just conversations. They did it through cultural work, music, performances. They did it by just even sharing stories of other workers, right, as a way for people to identify with others, right? And most people I talked to said that was actually like the most important thing that people needed to do in China right now, which was to kind of raise that level of consciousness and build that consciousness that there was even a working class in China. And what I was told was something that was important to know was that this generation of workers oftentimes is like the actual first generation of workers, like speaking of kind of factory workers in China, right? Like the development of China has been so recent, right? We're not talking about something like the Industrial Revolution from like the late 1800s. We're talking about like 20 years ago, and so they really identified that as like the critical step that needed to happen.
So before we get to questions, I think one more thing to note is that a lot of people who are doing this work as in the NGOs and talking about building working class power are pretty critical of the state, but aren't necessarily critical of the market. And so I think that's pretty key to kind of draw out because there's still a belief within the capitalist system in China that you can still kind of make it up through that system. And so, yeah. So we are. Are there questions about what's happening in China? Okay, because we're going to move into kind of what do we do here in the U.S. then. So we'll take questions about other questions about what's happening in China. So I see 1, 2, 3, Whoa, okay. All right, mini question Q&A, got it. All right, so 1, 2, 3 first. Go ahead.
Oh, I actually wanted to hear more about what you exactly just said. Like, what are the sort of ideologies of currency and these sort of like ad hoc social movements that form up, and what is their relationship to the state and to capitalism?
So we'll take the 3 questions and then the panelists can. Yeah.
My question was pretty similar, kind of. I was wondering about like, what is the analysis that a lot of the workers of China have of like the class system there, and like what is their relationship, and like what does the radical left over there think about the situation, because it's very unique, because China is technically communist, but it's not. But and how do they analyze that and work that into their organizing and grassroots, or even are they at that level?
Yeah, my question was just about, it's related, but it's really the question. I was just thinking when you were talking about the question of like traditions and models, you know, having a labor tradition or a left tradition. And I guess the thing that was occurring to me was, on the one hand, that creates all kinds of possibilities from what you were describing, and at the same time, the answer you got, which is, I don't know what I'm doing, I just feel like it's the right thing. So I guess it's really similar to the other questions. What kind of traditions do people have to draw on? Like, for example, is there any knowledge in China of like the labor strikes in Hong Kong and Canton in the 20s, late 20s, and that sort of thing?
A few scholars, some scholars.
Yeah.
So you guys can take those questions away.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to give a shot. So I think an easy way to understand what's happening in China is to think of a profound historical rupture of both consciousness and ideology that happened twice in a very short period of time. There are people alive now who lived under essentially more or less feudal conditions before 1949, who very rapidly saw a total and unimaginable transformation into a society without having gone through any process of private capital formation, immediately transformed into a political economic system in which there was no private capital, there was no wage labor, there was an incredibly flat class system. That's not to say there were not classes, but it was very, very flat. There was relatively little privilege. There was some privilege, but mostly it was privilege along the lines of, you might get into, if you were a kind of higher ranking cadre, you might get into the new apartments that were being built, with only 6 months of waiting rather than 3 years of waiting, things like that. So there's definitely some privilege, but the main thing from my point of view as a labor organizer is no labor markets, no proletarian. Nobody sold their labor on a private market. And so what that means is, for many of us who have been thinking about this, is that it was a socialist period in terms of its principles of equality, and that the landlords and the private ownership class were suppressed. That was true, that happened. But it was not what we think of classically as a socialist revolution, because this was not a process. You didn't go through a revolution led by an industrial working class. So what does that mean? It means that although there were these great principles of equality, that during the course of this 30 years, there was an authoritarian state that developed just as it did in the Soviet Union and all the Eastern Bloc countries. No previous historical experience of a rights-based or civil society-based culture in which people had this idea of a pluralistic political environment in which they could claim and form their own rights. It was always a society of mass organizations. So if you were a worker, you were represented by the ACFTU, by the All China Federation of Trade Unions. If you were a peasant, you were the Peasants Association, and so on. So coming out of that, now everybody was indoctrinated and certainly read Marx and read Mao and read the canon and engaged in sort of class struggle discussions, especially during the Cultural Revolution between 1965 and 1975 approximately. So then the second big rupture, which was the death of Mao, the end of the Cultural Revolution, and the rise to power of Deng Xiaoping, and the introduction of private capital and everything that came in its wake, And there was no ideological grounding or preparation for this, so what happened was simply, I would say, a fetishism of Western capital societies, particularly the US. So now, if there is any prevailing ideology in China, I'm sorry to say, but it is neoliberal. It is, we think the state is the problem, we think the market is the solution. Our goal is consumption. Our goal is access to consumption. The struggle for social goods is it is a felt need, but it is not expressed in any ideological form. So we could go on about this in more detail, but I would have to say the most encouraging, the best thing that's going on, which Mr. touched on, is that especially starting in 2008, I saw a definitive trend to become critical of neoliberalism, of the market ideology, and especially, thank goodness, among some of my students, and students all over the country, I have now come to understand a renewed interest in saying, what did Marx really mean? Not what I had to memorize and write on my politics exam when I was 14 years old, but actually what is historical dialectical materialism and what does it mean in China. This, I think, is the most profound shift and the most encouraging shift, and also students thinking, therefore, I should become a worker. I should start swimming in the sea of the people again and try and build a labor movement. Very small tendency, but beginning to happen.
Okay, I'm going to take this next round of questions, and again, questions on what's happening in China. So we'll start back here and then over. Okay.
I was interested to hear the role of nationalism in the movements or outside the movements, or it's just China plays such a unique role in the world, and then there's so much racism, particularly here, and I know all of you guys are involved in work here, and it's like a complicated thing, so I'd just be interested to hear it.
No questions here anymore? Awesome. Okay. And did you or Glenn?
Well, just to follow up
Oh.
a bit. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so
Someone
I'm
else?
going to go him and then
Okay.
back to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have two questions. The first question is, as I heard, there is some differentiation within the trade unions. You said they are very integrated, as opposed to this, right? But there is some differentiation in the South. It's a little bit different, so I want to ask you to give us some information about this. And the second question is, there was a campaign to organize Walmart. So I think it's very specific because they do not accept trade unions around the globe. So, but I think this was a rather positive example. Maybe it's very exception, but maybe you can speak about this.
You mentioned, Ellen just mentioned about students. Maybe a growing tendency to I guess, return to the factories, or to enter the factories. I guess I'm wondering, this is probably supported also by professors, intellectuals in the academia that are Marxist scholars who have been critical of the neo-liberal economy in China. And I just was wondering, has there been any communication, any outreach between those older intellectuals who have probably some experience as well in organizing from the past? Has there been any contact between them and the, I guess, maybe some of the vanguard people in the labor movement?
Anna herself actually educated a lot of students to go to factory, so she's one example to bring the Marxism to students. And can I quickly follow up 2 points so far? And I think when we talk about the issues of labor, whether it's a labor movement, social movements, or resistance in China, it's hard to not talk about the state. When we talk about state, state as just a very it's a negative force. It's a repressive. It's basically the target we need to, like the people really need to fight against. But actually, if we look back at what happened in the past several years, we see the state actually opened some political opportunity to the rise of labor unrest. Honda is a good example, the strike by the auto workers, and partly not because the state is suddenly become benign, and partly because the state itself face the pressure about labor unrest, and there's a central need to start, like the legitimacy is based on stability. To keep stability, so there's need to make some concession, make some room. So that's one political opportunity there. And the second is China. When we talk about issue, China is really changing so fast and at the center of global capital transformation. So we know the imbalance of global economy and the consumption and the capital over accumulation. So China has a big issue about imbalance of its consumption and production, right? So there's a need for states to actually have a rebalancing to distribute some, at least to stimulate domestic consumption. So that's one reason we see the wages in China, like the minimum wages, actually rising so fast. And partly the government, they keep on raise the minimum wage in response to both the labor unrest, but also to their need for the political stability, economic development. So I want to hear in terms like to think about how to actually we utilize this kind of political opportunity to open more space to push, especially in terms of like a discourse frame, and if you think about the civil rights movement, a lot of like social movements in the West, usually it's both bottom up and top down processes, right? So there's important strategy to think about how to utilize elites, utilize the top down power to push for the gain for the what they call the masses, right? So there's one comment. And the second, I want to also hear about the discussion about the power, workers' power. We talk about there's a lot of movement, resistance. So what kind of power, we talk about workers' power, workplace, a lot. So what do you see some changes in the past several years in terms of their marketplace, their maybe association is a little bit tricky here, but just to look at what the power workers actually gain over the years. So just 2 comments.
Can I ask one short question?
Okay. And then it doesn't have
I just wondered, it's just a question, what percentage of ownership is there by the state of the industry now? Because that's something I'm always asking, I'm not
about
exactly
32
sure
to
what it is.
35%.
35?
About 32 to 35%.
Okay, thanks.
And it's like the main, in like the major
Key
industry, all the key
industries.
industries are still owned
The commanding.
by the,
Commanding heights.
35%.
And they also have the ability and do sometimes renationalize things that have been privatized. The most famous example is the renationalization of many coal mines a number of years ago because they were being run in such a incredibly shady and corrupt fashion with hundreds of coal mine deaths every year.
Yeah, if you counted the state control, not particular state owned, the state have capital, like publicly listed, it's actually over 50% assets owned by the state. Because that's why they call it state capitalism. It's basically,
Okay.
it's really.
Thanks.
So can you start off with the nationalism question?
So we're going to jump back into the nationalist question, which I think actually ties with some of the resistance on the ground. And from when we were in China, a lot of people were sharing with us that since the economic crisis in the U.S., the government in China was using that as an opportunity to raise the contradictions of the economic crisis, and making a comparison of U.S. capitalism and the whatever I don't think they call themselves the state capitalists, but the Chinese government, the Chinese system, saying that we would never take that kind of a risk, right? And that we are safer and we have a better bailout, and it's like, you know, it's like we haven't reached that kind of a situation, right? And in a sense, it was like an anti-US, pro-China, where they started promoting the Chinese dream, which, so in this country is the American dream, and it's like, well, what is the Chinese dream? The Chinese dream is above and beyond what you can get in the US, because where we are gonna go in this country is gonna be better than the United States, right? And so what that fed into was a couple of things around domestic consumption and saying that we need to rely on ourselves. We are going to be the #1 market and producers of green, like electric cars. And in the meantime, we are going to be getting oil from Africa, Latin America, and we're not invading them. We are trading, and we are. I mean, so they created a narrative which is like, in some ways, it's like anticipating just some of the resistance. And so I think that to me was very helpful to hear, because it was just promoting this nationalism and this pseudo kind of state capitalism and bringing everyone on board. But I think because of what we've heard here, it's like once you start seeing when people start hearing that, it's like this is the best, but yet there's all these contradictions and there's all this. It's like people start to actually wake up in some ways, and I would say that even related to in the United States, when people come here, the way they talk about the government is so different than just 5 years ago. Meaning before, it was always like, yeah, you know, we're just a small country and we're just still getting by. Now people are like, yeah, China's rich. And why is there still these dock workers, right? So the consciousness keeps changing because the contradictions keep getting bigger and bigger. And so I think, you know, the comment that you were making about just the issue about power, right? The resistance is getting to a point where the government has to do something about it. And you know, the way I was trying to imagine it, it's kind of like those like bubble wrap, you know? It's like the government. So how hegemony works is like you want to control it, right? So in certain ways there are concessions that need to be made, and so I think at one point when we were visiting China during 2005, there was a strategic place where labor NGOs were a strategic place where resistance could happen, and the government caught on to that, right? So like pushed down, and then the bubble kind of comes up somewhere else, and then it's like unions for some time was like where the state was like, well, let's open it up a little bit to allow for unions to be a union and stabilize the economy. And then it's like, wow, they're getting too effective, so it's like pushing back down. And then the resistance just kind of moves around. And I think it's to give credit to a lot of so it's like responding to the contradictions that's happening, which is why I think this conversation is so important, because there are, what I heard a couple of times in our visit is that there are socialist seeds in this country, in China, right? So there's a foundation for change, but it's not like you can reduplicate what happened in the 20th century. So as a lot of us as leftists were imagining a vision for 21st century socialism, I think a lot of the theoretical leadership is going to actually come from China, because they're trying to form a new left, and it's not capitalist democracy. Though some people, there's like this conflation of let's come together and we need to change things. Oh, what do you want? Oh, yeah, we want democracy too, but that's linked to capitalism, right? And then there are old school, probably traditional Maoists, as they call them, that want this. But there's a new kind of conversation. I'm not sure if they call themselves. Some people say they're the new left, and that's some of the things that I've heard. But there's a new dialogue of really understanding what does socialism look like. That it's not 20th century style, centrally planned economies. It's like how is it really bottom up, and how, you know, it's like I think those are for me at least, it's like exciting that people are grappling with that, and they're looking to other leftists in other countries, and yet we're looking to them, and it's a very important moment, I think, because no matter what we want to say in the 21st century, something's going to happen in Asia, and that's just going to be the question. I mean, that's some of the stuff we'll get into in the next question, but how does that impact our role here in the United States?
The point I think that Lou raised will address the question that you asked about sort of Walmart and the trade unions in Guangzhou, and I can deal with this rather briefly, I think. Lou is correct to say that the state calibrates how it is going to rebalance economically, politically, socially. And in this period, 2005, 2006 particularly, we saw it up to 2008, there were several important initiatives, I guess, that many of us were rather excited about, including the introduction and passage of 4 new major labor laws, a labor contract law, a dispute resolution arbitration law, an anti-discrimination law, and I don't remember what the 4th one was, but anyway, these came on the books after a very, very high level of public comment was not only allowed but encouraged. So the government opened up a website for comments on the labor contract law and got more comments on that than they had on the last previously posted legislation, which was the new Constitution. So it was an extremely important public conversation that went on. The second thing was to signal in various ways that the trade union was going to be allowed to play a different role. And in different parts of the country it varies, and South China has always been considered the place where a lot of experimentation could go on. It's kind of the gateway to China. There happened to have been a couple of I will say both sincere and class-conscious, in a Chinese sense, dedicated working class leaders at the trade union level at both the city and provincial levels in Guangzhou and in Guangdong, with a great deal of influence, who felt that it was important to use the unions to try and help workers organize to face capital. And without having the time to go into it in detail, that experiment is over. And these 2 visionary leaders with whom we worked very, very closely had to retire this year. They both reached the mandatory retirement age of 60. And who they were replaced by were entirely business-oriented, very obedient, not, from our point of view, not unionists, people with no labor background, actually, to replace them. And so we are expecting that this experiment with allowing the trade union to become, to reform itself is at an end for now. The Walmart experience we could talk about in more detail, but that is similar. It was a moment in which it looked like they were going to tolerate bottom-up organizing, or dictate top-down organizing of bottom-up unions. And it was quite exciting, and it has been pretty much suppressed and reversed. So, the question of power, maybe we can get at a bit later. Let's go on to other questions, yeah.
Cool. So, oh, did you want to? Okay. So then the next round of questions is really going to kind of dig into what are some of the, where are my question sheets? What is our role in the U.S. and how do we tie it to what's happening in China? Especially kind of the grassroots organizations here, we work primarily with Chinese immigrants, right? And who are primarily in low-wage sectors, low-wage workers, and living in low-income communities. And then, what are lessons for us to learn, and what should we look out for kind of moving forward?
Sure. So I can start. Actually, sorry. So I was thinking about, someone asked a question about kind of like what is the ideology? What are maybe some of like the main ideological strains, I guess, that exist in China? Because there's several, right? Like, and they're all kind of competing, I think, with each other. What is the radical left analysis? And I think that's something that we thought about a lot, actually, and we didn't really go into that much. So I think something that was really interesting for me personally was talking to people and really seeing kind of the legacy of Mao and the communist revolution. how that legacy still remained for a lot of people in China. And that's something that you don't really, hear about in outside of China, because I think so much of what has been pushed, right, by Western governments, right, has been Mao was this dictator who people hate in China, right? Like there was that biography that came out by Jim Chang and with John Halliday that was awful. It was actually like based on lies, pretty much, right? But if you read a review of it, in like Western media, it was like Mao is revealed finally, right? But in conversations I had with people, particularly older people, like they really like valued and respected a lot of the accomplishments of that era. And I think a lot of the kind of like thinking and tenets seem to still really remain, right? Like even just kind of like basic ideas about, what does equality mean? What does social justice mean, right? What should be the role of the government, right, in our lives? Like all of that is kind of still there, right? The sense like it seems kind of like buried a little bit, but it still exists. And I think that's really important, right? When Alex was talking about like socialist seeds within the country, I mean, people who are in their 60s, right? Like that's what they grew up with. And the younger generation though, like younger people, I found it was like much more of a mixed bag, which I found really interesting also. So I did outreach a few times with this labor NGO in Beijing that worked mostly with construction workers. And so we go to like the sites, the construction worker sites in Beijing. And typically what happens is there's actually a temporary housing built for workers. So you can actually go to the sites and do like door knocking, right? And so, we didn't have like a long opportunity to engage them in conversation. But I remember one younger worker in particular like said something, and this has always stuck with me. One of the organizers from this NGO started talking to them about, like building power and like, worker struggle, workers' rights. He mentioned Mao, and this guy, like he was maybe in his mid-20s or late 20s, he basically responded like, oh, like all that stuff is in the past, right? Like Mao is the past, right? Like it's not relevant anymore. Like we have to think about the present. But at the same time, like he had a very clear and conscious identity, right, as a worker, right? Like he understood, he understood his position, right, like as a worker and what that meant. And then I think with all of like what Ellen and Alex were mentioning about younger people kind of rediscovering socialism, I think that kind of thing is being happen where people say, okay, like that's our legacy, right? But we want to create something new, right? And I think that's happening. And I only got a glimpse of that, but I think that's definitely something that I would really want to explore more. Like I met a lot of college students who are actually like, we learned Marx when we were growing up, and I hated it. I thought it was so dry. Like it had no relevance to me. And then when I got older, I happened upon a book in a library and I read it and I was like, oh wow, like this is actually what, Marxism is about, and, I get it now. And so I think there's like this rediscovery happening and like a reconceptualization happening. That's really, I would like to know more about it.
So maybe to link that to the question of international solidarity, that's okay, yes, just still jet lag, is that there is one role to be played, and is being played by people like Esther, Alex, and Helena, and also people like John Liu, that is those of us who are Marxists who go back and forth and engage with workers, with NGO activists, with students, with scholars, with even available people in the trade union who are available for serious conversation. There is sometimes an amazing amount of space to enter into very serious discussion, ongoing study, research, field work, to use the academic terms, not really organizing. Foreigners should not get involved in organizing in any way. That's absolutely inappropriate for many, many reasons. But the inspiration for young, I've seen it many times, for young students or organizers to meet someone like these three guys and hear about grassroots organizing here, done from a critical left perspective. How do you deal with redevelopment and gentrification in Chinatown, for example, in New York or San Francisco, and what does that look like in Guangzhou, and to recognize that there are similar global forces at work, financialization of real estate bubbles, student debt. Now, student debt in China is not yet a problem because most higher education is still free or relatively inexpensive. But this same question exists for young people in both places, which is you graduate from university, you may not get any job at all, you're not going to get a job that is going to allow you to get a home and to get married and to raise a family if that's what you want to do. So for these young people who are coming into some kind of critical consciousness to meet people like ourselves and have that sort of legitimization of their thought process is tremendously useful, and I think this is something we should focus on. We can't do campaigns in China. You cannot do what we think of, like if there's an important strike in Mexico City or someplace of, teachers or steel workers, and so you talk to the teacher unions here or the steel workers unions here and you say, let's raise money, let's write letters of solidarity, let's talk to the shared employer and put pressure on them. That is really not possible for many, many reasons. It may become possible, but it's not now. So we have to think of a much deeper and more embedded form of solidarity, in my view.
And maybe just as a historical context is that this is part of the legacy of the Asian left within the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in the 30s, and also movement leftists and activists in the Communist Party in the United States. There was a lot of exchange going back and forth. It was much more organized, but it was a lot of exchange and it was underground. And I think people don't really hear about it. I don't think people in China hear about it, and people here, definitely in this country, don't hear about it. But there's a strong tradition of leftists and Marxists from both countries that really built each other's movements. And it was done in a way where it was to support each other's movements, right? The 30s here, it was the Great Depression, and in China at that time was the anti-imperialist movement, right? And so I think that's just something to note, that there are some things it's going to have to look very different. And I feel like what we're trying to do with this question is that we actually feel like we need to take more leadership to put out some actual ways to think about it, right? And it is strategic for Chinese Americans who are organizing Chinese people to talk to people in China about our experiences, because there is a certain trend of thinking that we have talked about, is that people don't believe that Chinese people are oppressed in the United States, right? You hear about black people, you hear everyone carries a gun. I mean, you hear they have all these certain perspectives, but they never really get to hear from Chinese people. So in terms of like thinking about, well, what are they visioning as 21st century socialism or a society? It's like they think about the United States in a certain way. So when we went, we weren't expecting to break down how bad capitalism was. We're just like, it really is bad. It really is. And they're like, but no, isn't this? I was like, no, that doesn't happen. And so there's a lot of breaking down racism, understanding how that divides the working class, and getting to the question of like, one thing that they were very interested in was understanding like pretty much wedge issues, right? Documented against undocumented, like even people in Hong Kong, there's a strong anti-China sentiment because the Chinese ruling class or you could say the government, like are pushing forward a lot of developments into Hong Kong. So then the first reaction is anti-Chinese, right? but in terms of the people's struggles, there's a lot of work to be done, even, and so there's just, I think, in terms of what we can do is actually, I've had organizers from Hong Kong ask us for our curriculum, and they just want to know how we talk about organizing 101, outreach, how do you talk to people, how you describe capitalism, power, and so I sent them some of our stuff, and I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff that needs to happen. In terms of the specific question on solidarity, is that we just can't prefigure some of this right now. It's like, as we've talked about how the hegemony is trying to stay intact, the concessions are being made to different places at every time, so it's like, next time I talk to Ellen in 3 months, she's like, that's different now. I'm like, okay. Okay, so what do we do? It's like the concept, like we have this urge to want to support, but we also have to remember our tendency as like a first world nation as still coming from the belly of the beast, and what's the role? And some of the role is just to be ready, right? For when, it's like when the dock workers were on strike, and this is like 500 dock workers on strike against the richest man in Hong Kong, the 8th most wealthy person in the world, right? And this was amazing, and this was a huge solidarity fight that if we were more ready or prepared, we could have really helped and moved things. And of course, there was a lot of support effort from, labor councils and things like that. But I think there are opportunities that are coming, but we really need to build a better way of understanding how we could express support. And the last thing I'll mention is just that in San Francisco and the Bay Area, the new economic development model is to attract Chinese money. So it's not just like we are trying to support what's happening there, but it's the development is happening everywhere. So it's not just Africa, it's not just Latin America, but our mayor, Ed Lee, wants to make San Francisco the flagship for Chinese investment. That's what he's trying to move forward with. And there was a huge development that was going to happen and get approved. And I was already thinking about this whole thing. I was like, wow, so we have two major fights. How do we fight anti-Chinese racism and yet hold Chinese developers accountable, right? So it's like, that's the fight in the 21st century, right? And that's like what we really need to find is the nuance yet clarity of being able to intervene, but also it's like we have Western tendencies in this country, so we have to maintain that understanding on our approach.
I want to type one sentence onto this. So you've read about the Smithfield purchase, the proposed Chinese company buying Smithfield, the largest pork producer, whatever. So what you may not have read is that this Chinese company is actually got majority investors of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. So part of the way to deal with this question is you can just explode this myth of Chinese capital and say capital is transnational. Capital is more and more stateless. That is the quality of capital, and therefore also needs to be the quality of labor and labor resistance.
So before we get into the Q&A, what I'm hearing, especially kind of for us, for kind of looking towards the future and lessons learned, are particular around kind of what is our role here in the U.S. and in addition to what kind of Alex put out around we have to kind of I think in addition we have to also think about how do we understand China from a U.S. imperialist lens, right? Because the way that the U.S. relates to China is going to affect kind of geopolitics in the Asia-Pacific region, and U.S. imperialist interests in that region. And so part of our role is to understand China, is to kind of understand the worker organizing that's happening. But the other part of our role is to really understand what is the nature of U.S. imperialism in the region, right? And then the other thing is what we've been trying to do also through this first trip was to help us start a program where we can bring Chinese American activists to China, so that we can develop people in the U.S. who are born here like us, right? Who may not have a whole lot of language or cultural competency to be able to understand what's happening in China to then come back to do organizing work here in the US. And so we also think that that's a really important part of our work, that we have to demystify what's happening in China. We have to blow up what are the myths and the wedges around China. And we have to build in our own communities and build our own bases as well. And so I think that those were kind of the main lessons that we drew from this delegation and that we're continuing to kind of explore. So I guess we can open up the last 20 minutes to Q&A. Yeah. So we'll start with over here and then see who else. Yeah.
So I was, it's not exactly a question, it's just forming in my brain because before this panel I went to the panel about the Jackson Plan. And with the recent victory of Choki Lumumba and like kind of what they're implementing there, and then being in this part of the country where there's like, you know, in order to take what they're doing to the next step, in some ways you need to like you need some capital to come to the area. And so it was mentioned like given some of the challenges that they're gonna face within this country, international capital might be something that they would have to look at, and of course there'll be obstacles placed in front of that if there were some kind of direct connection between Jackson and the international capital. But I was listening to you talk, Alex, about Chinese capital coming to the United States and almost like kind of so I'm working through the contradiction of it all, and I don't know if people have thoughts on what that means in terms of like international capital as impacting people in a very devastating way, both in China and here, but then also the need for international capital to actually to move forward to advance a struggle that I think actually helps working people and oppressed nationalities in the country.
Oh, okay. You don't want to ask your question anyway?
Oh, sure. I'm just curious about like the current civil rights discourse and how LGBTQ stuff fits into that, and if there's any implications for civil rights discourse for workers.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if before this meeting's over, if you guys could just say what web materials and publications and or books that would be worth reading about what you've discussed and some of the work you've been doing, and both research and the exchange stuff and so on.
Trying to grapple with this question. So if what I heard you guys saying was that the kind of general worker struggle in China is on a mass level kind of more ideologically committed to capitalism and neoliberalism as a solution, but at the same time they are in struggle against essentially those same forces that are oppressing them. And given that there aren't really formal, strong organizations that are putting forward a left vision within that mass movement because they've been so repressed, how do you all see engaging with the movement in China as supporters of 21st socialism from this country? And I think it's been touched on, but I'm still trying to grapple with it in my head, like concretely, what does that mean? Who do you support and how do you support them?
Yes, one question, just kind of, actually a couple. But like my big question is definitely about like how do you guys organize Chinese Americans and Asian Americans here to be able to build connection and bridge and have solidarity with China? Because like I'm part of Bayan, which is like, it's like transnational kind of Philippine organization where a big part of what we do is build solidarity with the Philippines and Filipinos and Philippine workers. And my question is just like, for organizing purposes, like what are the difficulties and like how do you guys approach that? Because like I haven't really seen a lot of Asian American organizing work recently in what I know, in New York, that does work with trying to build those kinds of connections. So I just was wondering about that. And also, I just have a quick question about the Chinese, the one that Alex is from, the organization, the Chinese Progressive Association or something. Did that have ties to the Red Guard or Iroquois at all? It did? Yeah, I was just wondering.
That was a.
So can you actually tackle some of the, can you tackle this stuff?
Oh, okay. Yes, so regarding the civil rights discourse, I'm not sure if this is going to be able to get to your question, but we didn't really talk about the queer organizing that's happening in the country. And the best way I think to describe it is that when we talked about just some of the challenges that we saw, is that it seems like there's an LGBTQ identity that exists, and mostly in areas that are more privileged in urban areas, people have been able to quote unquote come out and be a part of things, and yet there are a lot of rural areas and villages and poorer areas that have less infrastructure that also want to be able to have that kind of a space, and so there are different challenges, right? But one thing that was very helpful is that they have one of the elders meaning they were late 30s, elders in the movement. She was just saying that it was just 10 years ago that sodomy was it's like being queer was not considered a disease, right? And so that just happened, and that shifting from that to now, and the development of all these groups and the consciousness, and using what the frameworks of the United States provided in terms of LGBT identity, and even now they're trying to grapple with what is queer, transgendered, and she was just saying that we just need to embrace it all at once, because it's like a compounded development of all happening at once, politically, socially, economically. The economy changes. And so she was just saying that they're still just trying to figure it out, and they know that there are contradictions with all of it, and that in some ways, whatever we've done in the United States in the progression of the civil rights movement in the different stages, quote unquote, is not necessarily useful for them in this current period. But yet, that is a lot of what they're grappling with right now. And so I think that was a helpful. I don't know if that answers the question, but that was a helpful way for me to understand it. And we have some stuff here of just showing a lot of the public actions that people have taken. And one thing I thought was very helpful in terms of just thinking about the strategy and how patriarchy is so powerful in China is that they organized and aligned themselves now with women's groups versus having an umbrella of LGBTQ. And some of it is because for a lot of the men in the country who are openly gay, they also want, like really truly want, their lineage to continue. So they, okay, this might be all stereotypical, but I mean, so in a lot of ways they're okay with arranged marriages, and like finding someone who's lesbian and gay, just getting like a fake marriage and having kids, right? But a rising concern within the lesbian community is like, well, I don't want to have kids. So
domestic violence,
and so marriages. Right. So then there's domestic violence, rapes, because they force, like they want, So there's a lot of challenges, and so when we met, they basically were talking about their kind of move and alignment towards the women's groups, which I think that's something that's probably in the U.S. context could look similar or different, but it helped me understand that they're figuring out a lot of things, and yet the context is so different, right? Because in some ways, because of it's like nationalism, it's patriarchy, and it's like all these things embedded into it. It's very powerful. The other thing is that just because of the hukou issue. It's like having like residency, is that people want to marry someone who's from the city. So that's also another challenge that comes in with like gay marriage, not gay marriages, fake gay marriage. Arranged, sorry, I'm very tired too.
So just to add a little bit more to what Alex was talking about, especially in regards to kind of a lot of the the lesbian organizations, and kind of their experiences are that that China is still very much under a one-child policy, and so for the gay men, it is really important, and for the families, it's important that their lineage continues on. And so then what Alex was talking about around the fake marriages are generally for people to be able to be in their relationships, but then also procreate, right, and carry on the name. That's one aspect of it, and then and kind of where women, a lot of the women have problems are around. They enter these marriages and then have basically no rights to property, to whatever, right, and are then at the whims of their husbands' families, and so then they fall into this patriarchal structure and practice. And didn't actually want to buy into that in the first place, and was trying to be free actually to live their life, but ended up actually a lot of times the men are much more free than the women in these types of relationships.
If I can just broaden that for 1 minute to say that the status of women in China changed incredibly for the better in 1949 and the subsequent years. And so the rights to political voice, to own property, to divorce a husband, to bring a husband up on, various kinds of charges for domestic abuse and so on, this changed dramatically. And many people would still say that the status of women in China is better than most other, or perhaps all other Asian countries. But what needs to be understood is that the degeneration since the end of the socialist period of rights of women has been severe. So that sex work was more or less eradicated after 1949, and the trafficking of women ended after 1949. And domestic abuse, there's no way to say it ever ended, but I believe, and what I've heard credibly told, is that it was no longer became the norm. It was delegitimized, and women still had to struggle against it, but it was reduced. And all of these things have returned as plagues. So the presence of sex work is built in through the society at many, many different levels. There was just this controversy some of you may have read about in Hainan, with where the revelations were that the principal of a school was procuring girls as young as the age of 12 and 14 for his business partners. And this was, exposed and exploded, but what it's mostly revealed is that some things like this are going on in many, many places. So.
And then there were some other questions.
One was on development, and then how do you
do solidarity work?
What does it look like?
I'm sorry I missed the questions, but I will say that I answered your question about sources. So if you want sites, there are others, but these will get you started, and just follow those links. Any others that you would add?
I would add Chinese resources, but this is basically the major English. Yeah.
These are the English languages. Yeah, I'm not a Chinese speaker, so. But you could talk to Johnny about those.
So maybe we could.
It's 5:15. When we're supposed to end. 5:20. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So maybe we can talk after this. So I was just thinking, because I want to clarify my point around like the China development stuff. It sounded as if, so I think that this is a big question we're going to have to deal with, right? Because it's going to come down to how do we fight for the terms that we want. So for example, the reason why it fell through in San Francisco is because this is the story of it, is that originally it was seen as a gamble. Like the old Congress, whoever was in charge, was willing to just kind of like just dole the money out and just not even care if it was going to be successful. Because Lennar, the corporation, was not able to get anybody to lend them the money for good reason, because they're corrupt and they're messed up. And so after the Chinese government looked at the kind of business plan, quote unquote, for Lennar, it just didn't seem like a viable project, and then that's why the deal fell through. But I think it's going to be a question of how, so what are the terms and the conditions? And the people in San Francisco were obviously pushing for local hire, prevailing wage, like all the basic things that you fight for in a development project. And I think for me, the added layer of what makes it complex is just it's almost like before it kind of comes into the door, like the Chinese development, there's already going to be a lot of challenges and hurdles, and I think that's where we're going to have a lot of challenges, and then that impacts how we fight for the kind of development that needs to happen. And then that's a debate already, right? Just like even what kind of economic development and affordable housing, all those kinds of things. So I think there's ways around it, and that's why we kind of need to we have to understand it in a more comprehensive way.
So we are pretty much at time. If there are any last words you guys want to say, maybe. Otherwise, we'll be here for a few minutes, and so and most of us will be here for a few minutes, right?
I have to run off.
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. And then always. The organization called Organization of Communities San Francisco.
So we're gonna